So this article was written in 1985 by Ted Irving in the section called Tectonics, and the title is Whence British Columbia. Oh, Canada. The paleomagnetic measurement of very large displacements among continents in the mid-1950s was followed by a decade of skepticism until evidence from the oceans made the case for global mobility unassailable. Similarly, measurements in the early 1950s of very large displacements in deformed belts within the confines of a modern continent met a large measure of disbelief. The orthodox view was that mountain belts were formed more or less where they are now. Recently, geologically young displacements have been found further and further eastward in the Cordillera, especially in the Canadian sector, as if the assemblaged patchwork of blocks had moved northwards as a whole mini-continent during the Laramide orogeny when the Rockies were formed, and that's between 80 and 50 million years ago.
January 1976, Yukon Highway 6, Canal Road, somewhere between Quiet Lake and Finlayson Lake.
Aaranya, how did you know that we would come here after listening to the Chief Healer's message in Swaitsea? And what are you doing with the Yukon-Tanana terrain map? I thought I hinted at the geology of the Peace River embayment during our last conversation, didn't I?
Yes, you did, Professor Scamander. And I started reading about the Peace River Arch as soon as we got back to Fraserton, so I could answer my question about the Yukon-Tanana and its flooding. I kind of knew that we would be going back to 1976 because Professor Bohm had figured out a clue during one of those 1976 dialogues with the Chief Healer. And I've kind of heard those so many times, so I think I had figured the clue. So I was clear on the year, and that's why I said 1976, but I had no clue about the location. From our last conversation, I learned that I was quite close to Mount Schaefer in Old Crow. So here's my guess. I think that the flooding of the Yukon-Tanana is considered as a good event because it was enfolding the map of the Deathly Hallows.
Not bad at all, Aaranya. I see how you made the Yukon connection there, which is correct, by the way. But I am still curious. How did you narrow down to this location near Canal Road? Also, what led you to the Yukon in the first place? Because I think your primary study sites, weren't they in the glacially induced fault zones of Sodankila and Kittila? You were supposed to be in Lapland, weren't you? We had not revealed anything to you. And like you said, I was deflecting for the most part and trying to keep you away from Old Crow. So just curious, what inspired this redirection?
You were keeping me away from the Yukon, but Professor Long was leading me straight to it. I don't know if I mentioned to you, but we had a field trip in Newfoundland. This was on magical water plants and fossilized marine animals. I think this was around the Avalon Peninsula. No, I think it was the Burin Peninsula. Yes, it was the Burin Peninsula first, and then we moved to the Avalon Peninsula. It was actually a herbology field trip, but then I was more interested in fossilized marine animals. So I asked Professor Longbottom if he had any specific notes on, or if you could point me to something on fossilized marine animals, since it was kind of a herbology trip on water plants and I wasn't so interested in magical water plants at the time. So he gave me Professor Long's notes, and when I came across those notes, he had mentioned brachiopods and trilobites. And then he also had this long letter on the closing of the Iapetus Ocean and some correspondence with Ted Irving. All of that seemed odd to me because Professor Long was not associated with the paleo world at all. Or at least that's the impression I had during my research on thestrals and their paleo habitat, because I had no evidence of his interest at the time. But I don't know, how did Professor Longbottom find those notes and what inspired him to share those notes with me in the first place. It was actually Ted Irving's papers that helped me redirect my research toward Western Canada. In one of his papers, there was a reference to upper Paleozoic fauna in the Western Cordillera, and in that paper there was a plate tectonic model that hints at northward translation of the Western Cordillera with respect to Cratonic North America. And that completely piqued my interest because the paleohabitat markers that I had found seemed quite anomalous around the Quiet Lake batholith. And so I dug some more, and I read through a lot, I think at least 22 papers on paleomag, and in one of those I came across Professor Johnston's Big Flush claim. And this Big Flush claim was about a massive northward translation of the Carmax group and its paleolocation connection to the Yellowstone hotspot. This paper saved me a ton of time because at the time I was traveling aimlessly around the Idaho, Montana, Wyoming boundaries trying to settle this Quiet Lake anomaly that I had found in the Yukon. That was how this whole thing got started for me, and I was heading in that direction actually to set up another study site around the Quiet Lake batholith, but my colleague found another strong anomaly along the Porcupine River near Rampart House, and that's how we ended up setting our study site near Bluefish River instead of Quiet Lake. If we had not spoken about Mount Schaefer, I would not have been able to make the connection. It was only after our last conversation where this whole Quiet Lake anomaly started to unfold for me, and that's when I revisited Professor Johnston's papers and some more paleomag papers, and then reassessed my question about the Ilonyoki flooding. All these threads seemed to connect at the Yukon-Tanana terrane. That's my best guess for why we are here, and that's why I have this Yukon-Tanana terrain map. That's just me guessing the location. I know we should be in 1976, but I don't know if we should be at this location. Are we at the correct location in the dead of winter, Professor Scamander?